Hello folks, hope everyone is well and enjoying your summer. So I thought it was time that I made a series of videos on Rahu and Ketu and their house placements in the chart. Before getting started, I wanted to mention, yes, I am still doing readings, and those who have had readings with me already know that you know that my assistant Karen is the first point of contact. So if you have any questions, she can answer any of them before you decide to book a reading. And yes, if you have not yet subscribed, please hit that red icon on the right hand side. And don't forget to press the bell notification too. Yeah? So let's get started. I'm just about to end my Rahu Ketu period. Rahu Dasha, Ketu and Dasha. So this actually gave me some time to think about Ketu and its impact in the chart. You know, Ketu tends to get neglected because there's so much focus on Rahu, its placement, its transit. In my chart, though, Ketu is much stronger than Rahu. Most of the planets in my chart aspect Ketu. And it also connects to my Lagna through Nakshatra, and it's close to my first house cusp. So it's very dominating influence in my chart. This brings me to my next point. To really understand astrology, and I think I've definitely said this before, it's always important to go back to the basics. So, for instance, for Leo and Cancer ascendants, the nodes are especially problematic. Why? Because the nodes are shadow planets that obstruct the sun and the moon, responsible for causing eclipses, and Cancer and Leo are ruled by the sun and the moon. Now, you may recall the story where the sun and the moon are the ones responsible for telling Vishnu about Swabharnu's trick to disguise himself as a divine presence. For those who don't know about this legend relating to the origin of Rahu and Ketu, I will give a brief summary here. Yeah. Basically, it's a story of seeking immortality. And this story exists in various different forms in many cultures, in many traditions. It takes place when both the gods and the demons were involved in a collective churning of the celestial ocean for Amrit, which is what? The nectar of immortality. In this legend, Swabharnu, who is a celestial demon, disguised himself as a god because he knew that the gods would be offered the Amrit, the nectar, first, and the plan was to finish it before offering it to the demons. But what Swabharnu didn't realize is that the sun and the moon, also present at that meeting, saw his disguise and told Vishnu to cut off his head before he drinks the nectar. The head was indeed cut. So Vishnu did cut his head, but not before Swabharnu took a sip of the nectar, making him immortal. Now he could not be killed. Instead, that chopped head became Rahu and the body became Ketu. And now Rahu and Ketu became the biggest enemies of the sun and the moon. And in this way, because divided into two now, they afflict the sun and the moon by causing solar and lunar eclipses. So that's in essence the story. Now, churning of the ocean here can be seen as part of the process of creation. And the Amrit that comes from it represents the continuation of life. It is a force of renewal. Symbolically, this renewal is immortality. Now, why is immortality considered to be such a great prize anyway? Because it is that which will give the power to completely transcend time, to conquer time. It's only in the hands of time, in the hands of karma, and therefore in the hands of destiny, that we feel bound, right, with no control. If you think about it, it's only in the hands of time that we cannot change nor control. Being immortal means being eternal, indestructible, that which lasts forever. And if you go beyond the symbolism, Amrit actually signifies true and supreme knowledge, divine knowledge, which helps us to overcome the slavery of time. The nodes simply represent this churning that goes on within us all the time. And we feel it, of course, we feel it very potently during the Dasha periods of Rahu and Ketu. And we become more aware of it also in that way. And ironically, it also suggests that we as mortals, we cannot obtain this nectar of immortality, this divine knowledge, this supreme knowledge, without the help of the forces symbolized by Rahu and Ketu, by the nodes in our chart. So if you can access this true knowledge leading to liberation through the Rahu Ketu axis in your chart, and this can ultimately release you from the bondage of time. And of course, the Rahu Dasha sequences will bring chaotic events into your life to lead you to this path. To see how this will manifest, you have to see where they sit in your chart. And it's during the Dashas and the Antardashas where life will bring circumstances that may show you this path toward divine knowledge. So, as I mentioned, the nodal Dashas, whether it's Rahu, whether it's Ketu, are the toughest for Cancer and Leo. But on the other hand, if you're Cancer and Leo Lagna, this also gives you the ability to see through and decode the nodes, similar to what we saw in the legend. Yeah, I want to cover some essential points about the nodes, and then I'm going to speak about their house placements as well. Now, all planets guide the soul to its goal of self-realization, which ultimately leads to liberation. But Rahu and Ketu, the shadow planets, they do so more in an intense way, in a more colossal way. They are your surest bet to understand the lessons and then obtain the freedom from the chains of karma. Ketu will get you there faster than Rahu, and so we only need 7 years of Ketu and 18 years of Rahu. During this Dasha sequence, you will frequently feel that life is completely governed by destiny. Reason is you will constantly have life experiences to show you what are known as the 6 internal enemies of the mind, also known as 6 ShadRipus. Only Rahu and Ketu will give you the opportunity to experience these internal enemies of the mind to the fullest and with the most intensity, to really drive that lesson home. And without these experiences, you cannot move toward the soul, toward divinity, towards self-realization. As you move towards self-realization, the grip of destiny will loosen, and then you will have the power to change your destiny. According to me, merely the awareness, just having the awareness of this, will enable you to change your situation for the better. Yeah. So what are these 6 ShadRipus? Internal, we also call them internal enemies of the mind, that bind the soul to the cycle of birth and death, and birth and death, and thus are operating from the subconscious levels, from the place where life seems to deliver fated outcomes that we have no control over. Well, lust is the first. Lust can also be desire, sensual pleasure, also known as kama. The second is krodh, or anger. The third is lobha, or greed. And then the fourth is delusion. It can also be infatuation, also known as moha. And then from that comes mada, which is pride. And finally, matsarya, which is envy, jealousy. And the first 3 are considered to be the most difficult to conquer. Right? Lust, anger, and greed. This is a cycle that keeps repeating. How does it begin? It starts with us strongly identifying with the external world, the world that we live in, which is essentially delusion, which is Maya. Consequently, you ignore the inner consciousness, which is the soul. This leads to a state of arrogance or pride, which is Mada. To stay in this state, you indulge in desire, meeting your desires, fulfilling your desires, which is Kama. And as these desires keep getting fulfilled, more and more desires take birth, as it always is, thereby creating greed, which is Lobha. And at some point, the failures and the inability to fulfill new desires leads to anger, which is Krodha. And then the mind starts to envy others. And then this cycle repeats again and again. When you're going through the nodal periods, this process happens very quickly and frequently with intensity. Being shadows, they obscure the mind and soul during eclipses. Moon, of course, being the mind, and sun, of course, signifying the soul. So this tells us that the position and the strength of the sun and the moon in your chart will greatly impact the results of Rahu and Ketu, because they're functioning on subconscious levels. Also, remember, they're simply mathematical points generated due to the motion of the sun and moon with respect to the earth. Right? Motion of Rahu and Ketu is different from other planets, as we know. All other planets rotate in an elliptical manner, whereas Rahu and Ketu are always retrograde. Moon's downward journey is Ketu, and the upward journey is Rahu. I'm not going to get into the technical calculation here. I'm sure many of you are already aware of this. But the important point here is, because they are mathematical points, they are generated points, and therefore shadows, not real planets, they cannot directly affect the material planes. Instead, they have to act through the signs, the houses, the planets, and the nakshatra that they get associated with in your chart. Essentially, this makes them facilitators. So where they're placed, whomsoever aspects them, their Lord's placement, will all determine their impact and their results. And of course, this impact is magnified greatly because their nature is to accelerate and amplify these areas in your chart. Right? Because you're working on the subconscious level. This is due to their nature. Their essence is to evoke that churning that I spoke about. Their essence really is just to evoke that churning impact in our lives so that we can ultimately understand the real meaning of life, of the illusions that we all get stuck in. Because they're shadow planets, they're doing so on the psychological, subconscious level. Their role is essentially to create like a push-pull towards your real self-identification. Yeah. But because they function on that subconscious level, they create immense fear during their dasha sequences. You often hear, in fact, you often hear the metaphor of serpents or snakes associated with the nodes. Rahu and Ketu are referred to as serpents. This association with serpents simply means karmic bindings. Ancient civilizations, particularly those that had a very intimate relationship with nature and their environment, always have stories connected with serpents. Serpents were considered to be the sustainers of the universe, of time, and thus they became the symbols for representing the cyclical nature of time, symbolizing creation and destruction, as well as regeneration. So they get associated with fertility and with, you know, with the creative impulse, the creative juices. To Native Americans, snakes represented the umbilical cord, which is the very sustenance of life itself. Snakes shed their skin, making them symbols of rebirth, transformation, but also healing. The venom of a snake can, of course, inflict death, but it also has the power to heal due to its chemical properties. Venom is associated with plants and fungi containing healing powers, and even the power to transcend conscious states. And of course, the unlocking of Kundalini Shakti. Right? In Eastern religions, snakes were considered protectors. And you'll often see serpent motifs in front of temples in many Asian countries. Now, getting back to the astrology. Here I want to reiterate that Rahu and Ketu do not operate on their own and cannot do so. They are merely facilitators, and they will bring forth the karmic consequence of wherever they sit in the chart, whom they associate with via conjunction and aspect, and of course their ruling planet. It's very important to see that. And due to this reason, they do not form a part of any yoga calculations in astrology, right? Therefore, the ominous, dreadful Kaal Sarp yoga that we hear about so much doesn't exist in any of the classical literature on Jyotish. Kaal meaning time and Sarp meaning serpent, literally translated as serpent of time. So essentially what happens in this yoga is all of the planets are on either side of Rahu and Ketu, and in essence in the grip of the nodes. As I said, it's a modern era creation. Perhaps because in the modern era many problems have a psychological basis, simply for the reason that our basic material needs have been met already. So in this way, it becomes more obvious when events in your life are not going according to your will, according to your intention, or according to your actions, but rather a karmic consequence of a past that you cannot see and that you cannot remember. In a chart as well as in transit, this can bring fated events, a feeling of a loss of control. If you have this placement, you'll have a deep resonance with the bindings of time, karma, destiny. Even at times, a feeling of being enslaved by time. But on the other hand, this also means a deeper awareness of karmic bindings that can ultimately lead to a spiritual awakening if you choose to go that way. Yeah. Because Rahu embodies the Vata element and Ketu embodies the Pitta element, Rahu will enhance Vata in its Dasha sequences when you experience the Dasha of Rahu or the Antardasha. So to manage Rahu, a practice calming the breath and consequently the mind is essential. Ketu is Pitta, so to manage Ketu, I think a physical practice is very important, like some kind of physical movement, exercise, as well as calming foods. Yeah. Now, we can never really examine a chart by taking one or the other as Rahu and Ketu are the same entity. This is often a mistake to overlook one during the Dasha sequence, as you get pulled toward one of them only. But the key ultimately is to balance them, and the opportunity to do so will continue to present itself in the Dasha sequence again and again, because you're dealing with an imbalance. Further, you have to see the chart holistically to really get their significance and potential results in their Dasha sequence. So simply put, if your horoscope shows spiritual promise, these grahas can propel you onto a spiritual path in their Dasha. For example, you have Rahu in a moksha house, right? One of the water houses, which is generally considered challenging for Rahu. But for someone who is spiritually or even religiously inclined, this Rahu will simply enhance that inclination toward liberation. It will create situations, it will create circumstances, or the person will reach this path, usually through some dramatic life events. Rahu, being the North Node, is more concerned with what is ahead, the future. For those who have experienced Rahu Dasha, you will feel an urgency toward future events. Something new, newness, beginnings, new starts, anything foreign you will be attracted to. In fact, you can tell if you tend to be more future orientated, you may be more so connecting with a Rahu in your chart. And Ketu is the opposite, it's the past. If you are more inclined to be in the past, then there's more tendency to connect to Ketu. With Ketu, though, you can also get stuck in the past, and this can lead you to feel hopeless, uninspired, unmotivated. Ketu is basically cutting away. It's ripping away all the material structures. It's ripping away the emotional attachments. But if it's working well in your chart, if Rahu and Ketu are working well in your chart, Rahu will allow you to see into the future, and Ketu will allow you to tap into your past experiences to make sense of them. Ketu is the sun disruptor, but not in the way that Rahu does. It's more due to chaos, something out of our control that happens during the Ketu phases, the Dasha, the Antardasha, that leads to a feeling of disconnect. And then, therefore, detachment results from that, the ultimate goal. Rahu, of course, is also the sun disruptor, but more so in order to experience something that is beyond the possible, the achievable, but leading to dissatisfaction. That then leads to detachment, the ultimate goal. Rahu, being the head, is all about thinking, planning, plotting. Ketu, being the body, is all about emotions, feelings, intuition. Where Ketu sits, there can be unresolved anger also. Anger is an emotion that is almost always connected to the past. The challenge and the goal is to balance these energies. Wherever the nodes are, in the houses, there will be problems with wherever they're sitting, whatever house they're sitting in, there will be problems with setting firm boundaries there. So when going through the Rahu Dasha, pay attention to where Ketu is situated, so you don't go overboard with a rational mind, ignoring your instincts and ignoring your emotions. And when going through the Ketu Dasha, try to remember Rahu's placement and signification, so you don't go overboard with the emotions. Maturity of the nodes. Maturity of any planet happens at a certain age. Then what happens is wherever the planet is situated in your chart, that area gets activated at that age. So results pertaining to that area of life will manifest. For nodes, I take Ketu to mature at 48 and Rahu at 42. So Ketu in the fourth house, for example, if it's sitting in your chart, at the age of 48 could bring a change of residence. See also what axis they impact in the chart. So for example, If Ketu is sitting in the first house, see also the Dharma Trikona in your chart. The 159 houses. And as well as the first lord. What's the Lagna lord doing? And its dignity, its placement. So for example, you are Leo Lagna and you have Ketu in the first house. See where the sun is situated. If it's in your 9th house, if it's in Aries, then that Ketu is going to bring good results. Check also the 5th house to see if there are any obstructions there. And then to get to the full measure, see the karmic control planet, the ruling planet of the nodes. So for instance, Rahu is in Libra. See where Venus is in the chart and what lordship it represents, to see where the field of activity will be during the Rahu Dasha. See also the nakshatra that Rahu is sitting in and where the controlling planet of that nakshatra is in your chart. Just understand where the field of activity is going to be. If there's a planet conjunct the nodes, the significations of that planet will override to some degree this field of activity. So in the same example, Rahu is still in Libra, but it's sitting with Mercury right next to it. Then the matters that Mercury rules will become forefront during that Rahu Dasha, as well as the matters ruled by Venus. Rahu and Ketu cannot work alone. So you will need to see the big picture. What is promised in the chart. So you have Ketu in the first house. Then it doesn't mean that automatically you will be psychic. You will need to see the 4th house. You will need to see the moon's condition to come to that conclusion, whether you will be psychic. Jupiter is the key planet for Ketu-related problems. Ketu craves liberation. And Jupiter holds the key to release one from ignorance, right? From avidya. So, deep study of spiritual literature, along with devotion toward God or one's guru, is the best solution for Ketu. Rahu, wherever it is situated, will make you feel a lack in your life. Always. There's a lack in that area. No matter what's happening. Even if you have everything you need. And you're constantly trying to fulfill it. There's a void. And you're sincerely feeling it. I don't think it's an issue of greed. I think you're sincerely feeling that void. But Rahu sometimes, it's going to create that smoke and illusion. So it may not let you see that. Actually what you have is all there is. That's just all there is. So, Jupiter's aspect though, on either Rahu and Ketu can really manage them very well. But not conjunction so much. That can damage Jupiter's signification. Yeah, depending on how close Jupiter is sitting to the nodes. The other thing I want to speak about is during Rahu Ketu Dasha, if you experience some kind of physical ailments, some problems, health problems, disease, first consider alternative therapies. Especially if you have the nodes in the 2-8 axis, the 1-7 axis, or the 6-12 axis. Now let me define what I mean by alternative, because alternative is just alternative compared to the mainstream perspective, right? Things like Ayurveda, homeopathy, acupuncture, natural herbs, yoga, spiritual practices, yeah? So, I'll give you my example. I grew up with homeopathy because my grandfather was a homeopathic doctor. So we were always given this as a first call of action rather than allopathic medicine. So even today I intuitively reach for this to solve a problem. Now, why do I mention this? The reason is that the nodes get associated with grandparents. So, if you grew up with certain rituals, they could be habits, they could be lifestyle habits, they could be the food that you intake, they could be self-care habits. Don't hesitate to try those first, particularly the ones that are handed down from your grandparents. Right? When you're in Rahu Ketu periods, the problem is not only is it difficult to diagnose sometimes what the issue that you're having is, but you also may get the wrong diagnosis from someone. So it makes sense to try natural means of treatment as a first call of action. The other reason is that it is scientifically proven that our DNA most resembles our grandparents compared to our parents. Rahu signifies paternal grandfather and maternal grandmother, whereas Ketu signifies paternal grandmother and maternal grandfather. And modern day science has confirmed that the genes of the grandparents are more prevalent in us than our parents, which makes sense. This is due to the fact that from one generation to the next, the dominant genes become recessive and vice versa. So if a particular gene was dominant in the grandparents, it would become recessive in their children, which is our parents, and then would again become dominant in the grandchildren. Yes? So in this way, we can see the relevance of the nodes of Rahu and Ketu in comparison to the sun and the moon, which is personified by the mother and father. Now, almost everyone experiences either Rahu or Ketu Dasha, one of the two, in their lifetime. And of course, you may even experience both if you live long enough. It's an important Dasha to experience in a lifetime, as it will speed up your evolution 5 times more than any other planetary period. And by the end of it, you will have completely transformed yourself and your life. One of the problems with Rahu Ketu periods is that you get stuck in the past or the future. Rahu's looking into the future, Ketu's looking into the past. Because they're the nodes of the moon, they're always connecting with the subconscious, and a lot of times things can feel out of control, fated. So if you are a Sun Moon Lagna, as I mentioned before, you will have a hard time with Rahu Dasha. And if you're a Venus, Saturn, Mercury Lagna, you will have a hard time with Ketu Dasha. If Rahu Ketu is sitting with an exalted planet, conjunct an exalted planet, or if Rahu Ketu's dispositor, the ruling planet, is exalted, then that node will operate through its highest principles and awareness. As well, your actions will not be catered to others to seek approval or acceptance with a well-placed Rahu and Ketu. The impulse to act according to what the nodes signify will be strong enough to overlook any societal or external influences. If either of the nodes is placed with your Atmakarka planet, in the Rashi, or the Navamsha, the sign in which this placement takes place, this combination takes place, will govern your inherent nature. It will also enhance the significance of the nodal axis in your life, especially during its Dasha sequence. Well, close aspect of Jupiter, as I mentioned, will refine the nodal quality, and it will help Rahu and Ketu operate from its highest aspect. With Ketu, if there is harmony with its ruling planet, with its dispositor, and there's a Jupiter aspect, then that Ketu can be a positive outlet for suppressed energy. It's not enough only to focus on the nodal placement, though. You have to really look at, I can't emphasize this enough, you really have to look at the entire chart. because, as I said, they facilitate what else is happening in the chart to bring you to your destiny. On their own, they can't operate on their own. Now, with respect to exaltation and debilitation, I do not strictly subscribe to this for Rahu and Ketu. Exaltation means to elevate. It can mean dignified, so functioning in its highest state. Yeah, so it's no doubt that Rahu performs very well in Taurus, Gemini, and Virgo, and Ketu in Scorpio, Sagittarius, and Pisces. Rahu is generally good in air and earth signs, being of Vata constitution, and Ketu in fire and water sign, being of Pitta constitution. The idea is not to suppress the desire that Rahu brings, or become an ascetic to manage Ketu's chaotic impulses. The ultimate goal, after all, is self-realization. To reach this goal, it need not be through practicing asceticism, but rather training the mind, the body, the senses. To do this, of course, you need workable spiritual practices. The right company is important. Disciplined habits are important. Desire is fundamental to life, so the solution is not to suppress it or ignore it. The problem that arises with cravings or desire is that you identify too much with the outcome of that desire, of the action that you've taken because of that desire. So identifying with the outcome is the problem, not the desire itself, and not the action as a consequence to that desire itself. Remember, if the nodes have the potential to bind you, then they have the potential to set you free. So that's all for now, folks. I will be posting the house placement videos for Rahu and Ketu over the next few weeks. If you enjoy the video, please comment, share, and subscribe. Cheers.